Okay, well, should we just
Let's
say action here?
Action.
All right, well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us over audio today. My name is Ellie, and I'm joined with Makenna here, and we are the creators of Erudition Magazine. Makenna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Makenna. Me and Ellie met in school at UCLA. I currently reside in Portland, Oregon, and I've been working on Erudition since the beginning.
So Makenna and I did art history together at UCLA, so that's what brought our passions of art together. So we wanted to start the magazine because we had to write a lot of papers while we were at UCLA, and we were taught by a lot of great teachers who made us do a lot of research. And I definitely felt at the end when we graduated that I had a lot of work and a lot of passion for that research that I'd done and nothing to do with it. There was nowhere to put it. You know, especially being in the job market as like a new graduate, it's really tough to put yourself out there. And I thought that being able to publish this work that you've written for school and had the guidance to put a lot of really thoughtful research into, putting that out there would just help get your voice out and be recognized for the work that, you know, all students have to do, really. So
yeah, what I really loved about Ellie's idea about the magazine is because I was at this point where I had just gotten my first job out of college, but it wasn't in the field of art. And it's exciting to get a job, but it also can be a little bit demoralizing when it's not in the field that you studied in, especially if you're working in the humanities. And it's very hard to get a job in that right out of school. So being able to work on this, and for myself, it was very fulfilling work, but also to give other people and other recent grads the opportunity to have an area to be published in and to showcase their work is something that I'm very passionate about, and it makes me happy doing the work and helps give me a better sense of self as I'm working on it rather than like my corporate job.
Right, yeah. And to get a job out in the art field is highly competitive. I know I had an interview at the MoMA, at San Francisco MoMA, I think back in September or something. And it was for like a front desk, you know, like to sell tickets and stuff. And everyone else there, they all had like MFAs in art or like at least a graduate level degree in art or art history. And that was really intimidating because I did not. And I think ultimately that was one of the factors that led me to not get a call back for that position, which is really unfortunate, but it really shows how intense the competition is in that field.
Yeah, and I remember I worked as an intern at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and there was a person who was working an entry-level job who had a PhD in art history.
Wow. Yeah.
And it's also difficult because a lot of the people holding the director and curator positions might not have the same level of education because the field was different in their day.
Right.
So it's an interesting time. So we just kind of created our own positions.
Yeah, and I really hope that this magazine helps bridge that gap a little bit and kind of creates that extra, you know, that platform up there and make it a little bit closer for everyone. So that's my goal.
Yeah. Ellie, what brought you to art history? Why did you decide to study that?
That's a good question. Well, I do come from a family of artists, especially on my dad's side, like my grandma and my aunts and uncles and my cousins, they're all kind of art oriented, which really inspired me growing up. And my family is really into museum going. So my mom would always take us to the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco and the MoMA and Legion of Honor and like even the Tech Museum in San Jose, just all these different museums out in the Bay Area and even throughout California. But growing up, I hated it. It was so boring to me. But as I got older, I learned to appreciate that more and just get a better, when you're exposed to so much great art, eventually it's gonna kick in like, this is amazing. And it really just hit me one day when I was on my way to a tennis match in high school that I was like, I want to do this for the rest of my life. I love art so much. I don't know, that's it's really just like the influence of my family that really helped me see the greatness in art.
Yeah.
What about you?
I kind of had an opposite upbringing. I was the first person to bring my dad to an art museum. He had never been to one before. And I didn't really grow up in an art focused, or I guess if you want to say traditionally like cultured household. But I was always seeking out art when I was growing up. I just didn't really realize that. I was always very into music and very into specifically like album cover designs. And when I originally went into school, I was pre-med. And then after I took one art history class, I changed my mind because it was so clear that I wanted to study it and kind of figure out a way to make my life about art and really devote my time to that.
And I'm very glad you made that decision.
Me too. I'm glad you made that decision too.
Thank you. Well, anyway, we brought everybody, you all, whoever's listening, here today to introduce you to us and to the magazine and to talk about something that we thought is really interesting and really relevant even today. And an artist that you all might recognize is Jean-Michel Basquiat, street artist originally from the 1980s. I don't know if you want to give an intro on him or...
I'll do a brief intro on Basquiat, even though you pronounce his name so perfectly.
I took French in high school, so...
I'll do the cliff notes of the basic biography of Basquiat. He was born in 1960 in Brooklyn, New York. His father was a Haitian immigrant, and his mother was a second-generation immigrant from Puerto Rican descent. He died at the age of 27 in 1988 because of a heroin overdose. Mm-hmm. A big part of Basquiat's life and his career is his relationship to substances. He was kind of a savant as he became older. His mother was the one who took him to museums. He was exposed to art from a very young age, but he dropped out of high school and really just the long and short of it ended up on the streets, like a lot of people in New York during the 70s and 80s.
Right.
And then eventually became a street artist known as Samo, or a street artist pair known as Samo.
So originally, Samo came about with his school friend, Al Diaz, and Samo was kind of an abbreviation of same old shit.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, the street art kind of period in the 80s. It was really big back then. Everything was covered in graffiti. If you've seen like the subway cars, they used to be completely plastered like inside and outside in graffiti. And like I think it was probably good to be a graffiti artist relatively in that time in New York. Like Keith Haring also got his start as a street artist, and they both rose to prominence from there, but ultimately met a horrible demise. But I think it's interesting. I don't know if you know about the whole like 27 Club thing.
I do, yeah. It wasn't until I started doing research for this that I realized that Basquiat was a part of that.
Yeah, I saw that Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix, two of his inspirations, both died at the age of 27.
Wow. It's a really interesting thing, especially because I was watching the documentary specifically covering Basquiat's years as a working artist called Boom for Real. And they were very clear that he lived kind of like a rock star lifestyle and was definitely like a rock star figure in the community, which makes sense because there was so many of those kinds of personalities in New York at that time. He just lived a very hard lifestyle that was very uninhibited by anything.
Right. Well, we really owe the beginning of that kind of hardcore art party scene to Andy Warhol in like the 60s. That's when art, music, and like kind of the social scene really just their boundaries blended all together. And Andy Warhol and Basquiat were actually apparently really good friends back then.
Yeah, I look at Andy Warhol and I look at his rise to fame. Even to this day, I don't know if there is an artist, at least who has come out of America, who was such like a cultural shift in the art world. To have this celebrity along with being an artist, I think is kind of unmatched, especially when the artist is still living. And so he was kind of this like living embodiment and example and goal of what the artist working in New York could potentially be. I don't know if without Warhol, if Basquiat's work would have ever been recognized in the way that it was.
Yeah, well, I think Basquiat and the whole kind of street art movement definitely owes a lot to the pop art movement, because pop art kind of grew out of this critique of the idea of materialism and thinking that everybody was too obsessed with brands and just material items. And street art kind of popped up in the same way, where it was very anti-materialistic, kind of like against the system, anti-capitalism, and in a very like rebellious aspect. And similar to lots of Andy Warhol's works, like the Campbell Soup thing, Basquiat's work combined images and text, and it was almost like a political cartoon in that way, because it was very satirical.
Yeah, and even especially in regards to how anti-establishment it was, all street art is essentially kind of destroying the idea, or the act of making street art destroys this idea of like public property. And really like, because if you take a look at like, this is public property, this is property that's owned by the government, and it's owned by, which, you know, if we're like in America, is technically owned by the taxpayer, and somebody decides to deface it or claim it as their own and express themselves on it through art for the people. In my opinion, like, street art is one of the most altruistic art forms that you can have, because it's like it's art made on public property for the people, kind of like there's no ulterior motive behind it, especially when Basquiat was working under Samo, and he, like, his name wasn't even directly attached to it. Kind of giving the finger to people and being like, I don't really care if I'm not supposed to draw on this, like, I'm gonna say what I want to say and put it on display for anybody who walks by this to be able to see it.
Yeah, that's another thing too, is when I was researching all this and thinking about like why street art became so popular, especially during this time, I was thinking, you know, before that, in the civil rights movement and all these different movements and changes that happened, like with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers and like La Raza, there was a huge kind of influx of more public art being made through posters or mail art or street art, things like that. And that's when this whole movement that was like calling for radical change happened. And I think that made art a little bit more accessible to the people. It also called for change at the same time, like social justice. And then I think that the reason why it became so popular was it kind of converged at the same time as pop art, which was in the galleries, versus posters and mail art and all that stuff. They were outside of the gallery, more in a public space. And then those street art kind of met at the middle of those two in the 80s.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that it is kind of like the convergence of those two. It's also important to think about New York during Basquiat's life. They had just experienced one of the largest white flights in America's history, which means that the crime rate had gotten so bad that, or vice versa, basically the majority of the white population just up and moved out of New York. And it was just the lack of resources available to people there just kind of created a tumultuous place. And of course there was always like rich New York, and of course like there's this idea of like Andy Warhol working as an artist in his factory, having his own brownstone in New York, being like this like very like pinnacle of success for an artist. But at the same time, you had Basquiat, who was essentially homeless and kind of more of a like vagabond, like switching from place to place. But it seems like that's kind of how everybody was. And in the same realm, it might have been very tumultuous, but it was also very community oriented, because they didn't have, it wasn't as safe, and you kind of had your own friends who were like watched each other's back and allowed each other to stay at each other's place and introduce each other to other people, and just kind of create this really beautiful moment in art history, and in especially the history of modern art, like seeing people like Keith Haring and Basquiat, who ultimately met a demise, but also were lifted up by the people who were surrounding them, who did make it out. And I don't know, it kind of, the camaraderie that happened in New York in the 80s is something that I think is like a very rare thing. It's not like New York now.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that there definitely was a better sense of community overall back then than there is now. But I think definitely back, or like I mean I could see that now too. I think amongst other artists, there was definitely a community there. And he was couch surfing a lot when he was basically homeless, but there was the huge kind of adversary, which were the gallery owners and representatives and the museums, who did often take advantage of him, and they kind of just saw him as like a monetary like machine, and the works that he produced, they really just kind of took advantage of that. And I think that it really kind of spun him around and made him feel disoriented, to where he just, I think it ultimately led to his death.
Yeah.
And I think definitely in the 80s too, with the crime rates going up, that there was also a really big income gap. And so there were a lot of yuppies who were basically like majority white people, who were going around galleries and like buying everything they could. And especially like the hottest new artists, which was like Basquiat and Keith Haring at that time. And another thing about why street art became so popular was because at this time, the yuppies were so into this thing called radical chic, which was like the civil rights movement issues were adopted and promoted by wealthier people kind of as like a status thing, and not because they believed in it. It was more just because it was trendy at the time. And so for these street artists who were kind of being like against the system and rebellious, wealthy people were into that because that was what was trendy at the time. And that's why they kept buying all these things, is because that was what everybody was into. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Do you think, had it not been for the gallery scene, for kind of like the people, I'm going to use a word like kind of like a token, purchasing this like radical chic, do you think without that Basquiat would have been as well renowned today as he is?
I think certainly Basquiat was in the right place and the right time. Being a young Black artist doing graffiti in New York, especially. If he was anywhere else, probably in the world, maybe besides like LA or San Francisco, he would not have been recognized. And I definitely think that he was exploited for just his skin tone. Yeah, I think his work definitely is amazing, and he showed so much promise and talent. But I think that if he wasn't in New York in the 80s doing what he was doing, it probably would have gone unnoticed. Yeah,
it's just an interesting thing to consider, because when we were researching this, the thought just kept coming into my mind where I was like, it's very possible that like this couldn't have worked out for him. And also, which I mean, I guess ultimately it did not work out, but also like how many people have been like him and so talented where we just have no idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think especially today where there are so many artists and just so many people in general, it's so hard to break through that and be seen by other people, especially because artists today have to do everything themselves. They have to market themselves and really put themselves out there and try really, really hard to just be seen by people. And I think definitely Basquiat, like for him, it was like other people, he had his network, and other people also, because he was in New York and around people in the gallery scene, they saw his work and they recognized it as good and just went from there pretty much. I think that's why a lot of people, like artists, they move out to more metropolitan areas, because that's where they have a chance, really, until they can get a studio in the middle of somewhere else.
Yeah, but even then it's like if you don't have like a brand or a name built up at that point, then you don't really have a chance to at least like make your art lucrative. I also have another question for you, Ellie. How do you feel about the labeling of his art as neo-primitive?
I feel like that's probably an inappropriate term, or just it's not applicable here. I think that's probably something where it's a little bit biased, that label. I mean, I personally, when I look at his work, I immediately think like neo-expressionist. And I think like if you wouldn't think to call, for example, if it was like Keith Haring's work, if he did the same work, you wouldn't think to call it neo-primitive because he's white. And I think people who've called Basquiat's work neo-primitive are probably just looking at the color of his skin and judging it by that.
Yeah, and I find it really interesting because I opened up like a modern art, like kind of coffee table book and found Basquiat's profile in that. And they had his work labeled as neo-primitive in there. And I think it's really interesting because there are some of his works that I understand the sentiment behind it, because it does almost read as like a cave painting in like the same like format and same like flatness. But also that to me is so simplified, and almost like the primitive artwork that we've seen and studied, like a cave painting, is made so simple and is abstracted but like readable so that so many people can understand it. Whereas with Basquiat, I think it oversimplifies his work to call it neo-primitive, because it's so complex, and a lot of the times you have to stare at it for quite a long time until you understand, or at least start to try to understand what's happening and what he's trying to say. And I think for everybody, he's one of the few artists that I really like connected to in modern art, because I do think his work is so expressionistic in nature. And when I see it labeled as neo-primitive, you make a really good point that like you would never label Keith Haring's work, even if he produced the same work, in that way ever. And
yeah, I mean, I think like de Kooning's Woman, you know, that painting, I think I may have seen that before labeled as neo-primitive or describing it as primitive, but I think behind that it was his intention to depict woman in that way, whereas for Basquiat it was not his intention.
Yeah.
So I think that's really the big difference there, and something that a lot of people I think don't realize about modern and contemporary art is that it's not so much about the product of the art, it's really mostly about the concept behind it and the techniques that went into it.
Yeah.
So I think calling it neo-primitive is like somebody didn't do their research, you know?
Yeah, it's kind of, and it's a little just like condescending, I guess.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, I was interested in how you felt about that, because it was just a very interesting thing that I kept coming across in my research, especially with everything happening right now in the world. It's interesting to look back on even a simple thing like how we categorize, it's not a simple thing though, it's how we categorize one of the highest selling painters in history still is influenced, even subconsciously, by the color of his skin.
Yeah, well, that's a big reason why people took advantage of him back then, and why a lot of not just artists, but you know, musicians and athletes and more are exploited as well, is based purely on the color of their skin. Yeah, and I was looking at that have been happening and are also happening today are continuing exploitation of Black artists, Black musicians, Black athletes. Like I saw that in the NFL, there are only 2 owners of color out of all the teams that are happening in football. And it's just that wealth gap too. It's so crazy expensive to be able to own a team, or like even part ownership of a team. And then the majority of these athletes that are like in the NBA and the NFL, there are predominantly Black athletes, and they do get paid a lot, but they're definitely exploited and kind of objectified too in these fields as well.
Well, and I think about even just how the proportional of Black athletes, Black professional athletes who end up losing most of their wealth due to like an injury or just to bankruptcy after their career has ended is just insane. And the wealth distribution in this country is obviously like astronomically out of proportion. And even in like a class, in like professional athletes where you're like, they're getting paid so much money, it is still, for a lot of those people, like kind of the only option they had to ever make that much money.
Yeah, I was looking at this Rolling Stone article too, and I saw that that's also common in the music industry, where no one kind of supports them in like signing contracts or anything, and tells them if they're getting a good deal. So oftentimes these musicians and athletes are getting uneven contracts where the owners or the record deals are getting a lot more, or the record companies, they're getting a lot more money than the person signing the contract is. And so there's this huge like disproportion of wealth going on here, and it's just very, very common.
Yeah. I think about even on a smaller scale of just like kind of the more everyday artist. I'm sure that everybody's been seeing the kind of fun, very aesthetically pleasing informational graphics that have gone around Instagram lately. I read an article recently in the New York Times that was referencing how these are proportionally Black artists who are creating these. And I can't imagine that they're being compensated in any way.
And how many people do you think are copying those too and just not giving credit?
Exactly. And I mean, not giving credit to Black artists can go back for centuries, even in most of the music that was produced like pre-civil rights era. There is so many Black women who were featured and either provided background vocals or production help on some of the most famous music tracks of all time, and they are just not credited.
Tying in Basquiat to what's happening today, there's a plethora of street art that we're seeing today, and all these Black Lives Matter murals, or I don't know if you saw here in Oakland around Lake Merritt, there's the all Black trans queer non-binary women's disabled in prison lives matter, which I think is really great and very inclusive as well. And it's in huge letters all around Lake Merritt, so it's kind of forming this like U shape. And the only there's a couple tall buildings around it, but the best shots are like by drones. Like it's kind of this new thing where you can really only see these art pieces unless you're higher up.
Unfortunately, in Portland, we don't have any of the larger murals that are like viewed by drone, probably because there's just too much going on at all hours of the day for anything to be painted. But what I've seen in my walks and, just being downtown is, and I personally have known a few artists who have participated in making murals on all of the boarded up buildings, which is honestly just like quite a beautiful thing to see, is like this kind of reclaiming of a space. And as you said before, kind of like street art seems to be always most prominent when it is in regards to a big like civil rights or some kind of very personal movement that's going on in the area that it's being made.
Yeah, I think a big thing with public art is the fact that it's the majority of the time it's to send a message, and I think as well as kind of beautify the area, which definitely I think these are doing both for sure. And I know that there's a lot of controversy behind street art, and a lot of people are like, oh, is that art or is it vandalism? But I think what a lot of people may not know about these murals that are happening today are that a lot of them are being done with permission from those cities. So people like, there was Martinez, which is like kind of north of here. There was like a couple of white people who had painted over the Black Lives Matter mural that they had on the street there. The city actually arrested them because the city gave those people permission to paint Black Lives Matter on the street, and so those people were technically vandalizing because so they were trying to like counteract what they thought was vandalism, but in the end they were vandalizing.
And it is really interesting to see the works be created on such a large scale that, especially in like a time of quarantine, depending on where you're at, what's open and what's not, like in the time of COVID, to have these large scale paintings be made that can kind of only, you understand their magnitude more when you see them virtually rather than maybe if you saw them in person.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially because they're written on the street and the letters are massive, I think walking, down the street, it wouldn't have as big of an impact as seeing the whole thing together and just kind of seeing the scale of it. It reminds me a lot of land art, which was a big thing back in like the 70s, I believe, around then. Kind of the combination of land art and like skywriting, but skywriting like flipped onto the ground, And yeah, and a lot of land art didn't, like, I don't know any of it that had text. So this is
Yeah.
this is definitely a kind of an evolution of that. I can see the tie there.
Yeah, and I love exploring the relationship between text and image, which is why Basquiat is so such an important influence on me, is because he plays with text and images so often, and he has such a interdisciplinary kind of reach with all of his work as like a poet and as an artist and as a painter. And so seeing a mural that is just text, there's something just so striking about it, because it's like, I almost get the same feeling as when I like stand in front of like a Rothko. It's so large in scale and it's so kind of in your face, feel this, that it's almost impossible to ignore and also kind of impossible to just brush off entirely. Like it really stays with you in a certain way.
Right. Well, thinking about kind of that, like the width of the street as your canvas, these words take up this entire canvas and it's trying to get the message across. So I think that right now it's so important for people to know these things. And it's just gotten to a point where we just have to spell it out, and to make sure that everybody sees that and recognizes that. And I think that's just kind of the point that we've gotten from, like this evolution of street art to now these murals are just purely massive words on just a really large scale. And so it's just really interesting to think of like the evolution of that. But I was going to mention too, like it's really interesting about Basquiat's work, and I saw that he created a lot of pieces where he did have a lot of text around, but a lot of it were just like repeating letters, which apparently is like kind of the sounds of like sirens. He was trying to like make these, like imitate the sounds of sirens, which I don't know if you could see this one, but he just had like a lot of A's and O's in it.
Yeah.
This is his Cadillac Moon from 1981, and apparently he was just trying to like imitate so it's interesting how sound kind of is involved with like a painting, and I think that's really an interesting technique to use.
Yeah, and it's kind of like, I don't know, it's very stream of conscience in its creation, which doesn't really surprise me at all with him, because I don't know, it seems so free-flowing when I see any of his work, that it just seems very, I guess, uninhibited and not like he's not holding back anything, and kind of anything that enters his mind goes onto the canvas. But in a way that he is such a master at, and he's so intelligent that it seems to always work together.
Yeah, and text and street art is definitely they're kind of synonymous there, with tagging and stuff. So I think that just kind of has a deep history, and when he got involved in that, it was just like he helped evolve it even further. And when I think of like, there's a lot of street art around here, especially like really good cool examples of graffiti, and they really mess around with typography a lot, where the words become drawings in a way. So it's this kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of like the opposite of like the Black Lives Matter, where it's like the images are now just the words. For a lot of these graffiti things, it's like the words are the image. And I just like, I think it's really interesting how it's very fluid in that way, how text is just like becomes art in different ways.
Yeah. And something that I really love is that even though he was such a big proponent, like he used text so often in his work, but the majority of his works are untitled, which I think really kind of changes, at least for me, like I typically read a title before I look at a painting, or before I look at any work, and to see so many untitled works, it's, as a viewer, you're just really going in blind with like no preconceived anything.
Well, that's why I definitely think that he's a neo-expressionist, because when you're thinking of expressionism like Rothko or like Jackson Pollock, they had a lot of untitled works, and it was just kind of throwing you in the dark there, and it's purely about how you react emotionally to those works. And I think that's definitely a hard thing as a viewer to do.
Yeah. It's a hard thing too, because if you're not, I know after studying art history and like having a degree in it, I do feel better about going to a museum and talking about art. But for a lot of people who don't have that same familiarity with it, to go see an expressionist work it's very intimidating, because it's like, oh, this is modern art. I just don't get it. It's very easy to look at it and say, not for me, I just don't understand it. I do find that, at least in my opinion, I think that Basquiat his works are very playful and they're very funny. And he has such like an accessibility about him that there's no, I never feel any pretension around his work when I'm looking at it.
Yeah, I definitely think that he wore his heart on his sleeve, and you can really see that in his work. You can tell what he cared about. He did paintings of his grandma. He drew and painted a lot of figures, which he read Grey's Anatomy when he was younger and really influenced by that. And you can tell also what he didn't like the gallery owners and people who felt were taking advantage of him. You can tell who was inspired by, like other black athletes like Jesse Owens, Sugar Ray Robinson. And you can also just see like what he was seeing, like the New York kind of city. He drew a lot of that and painted a lot of that, and it really kind of shows his perspective in his work, and that's something that I really appreciate about him.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
What can we conclude here about Basquiat and his influence on us today?
I definitely think that street art obviously would have never been the same without him, but also I think that the art world and people in general, I don't think would view street art in the same way if it wasn't for him. I don't think that it would be viewed as, at least for me, as like widely accepted as art or be as respected in general if his works had not been as widely accepted as they were. His influence lives on, and I mean, now he's one of the most influential artists that's ever lived.
Yeah, definitely. I think that he was definitely a pivotal point in that bridge that brought street art to galleries and kind of to the art scene today, and especially to museums, which is a huge thing to be recognized in museums like that. And I think that a lot of street artists today, they owe a lot to his influence. But at the same time, I think that he is a good example of, like many other people, unfortunately, who was exploited just for the color of his skin. So
Yeah.
I think that's something that will hopefully in the future, with all the stuff that's going on right now, we can create the change that can end that and kind of equal the playing field.
Yeah, and really kind of learn from this hugely important person who, because he was so wildly exploited, ultimately it led to his end. And hopefully we can learn from that, and hopefully the art world, and now because art is so widely available and produced, just the general public, when you see an Instagram graphic, somebody made that.
Mm-hmm.
And they spent a lot of time, and really just be mindful of the people who are creating art now, and take a look at the art that's being put on the street, and like really try to see it and don't look past it.
Yeah, and don't judge a book by its cover.
And don't judge a book by its cover.
Okay, well, thank you, Makenna, and thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any comments, please feel free to comment below, and we will see you in the next episode. Hey, thanks for joining us for our very first episode of Erudition Podcast. Don't forget to check us out on our website and subscribe at eruditionmag.com, and follow us on Instagram at Erudition Magazine.